Montana Territory, 1880. The sun set behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the wide Montana sky in hues of orange and purple as Mason Stark rode his chestnut gelding down into the valley. At 25, he'd already seen more of the wild country than most men twice his age, drifting from ranch to ranch, never settling, never allowing himself to form attachments that would only end in heartache. The war had taught him that lose too many friends and eventually you stop making them. "Just you and me, Copper," he murmured to his horse, patting its neck, "the way it's meant to be." The fading light caught on the tin star pinned to his vest. 6 months as deputy in Silver Creek had been long enough. Time to move on before the townsfolk started expecting him to put down roots, before they started treating him like family. Mason's lean, muscular frame shifted in the saddle as he surveyed the valley below, his clean-shaven jaw clenched at the sight of smoke rising from chimneys. Another town. Another temporary stop before continuing his endless journey to nowhere in particular. 2 days, he promised himself. Get supplies, maybe a hot meal, and then we ride on. His green eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the horizon. The frontier was no place for lasting connections. He'd learned early that in this untamed country, attachments were dangerous. People died, people left. Better to keep moving, keep your heart guarded behind a wall as sturdy as a frontier stockade. The sign welcomed him to Cottonwood Springs, population 212. Mason didn't plan on becoming number 213, not for long anyway. As his horse clomped down the muddy main street, he noted the usual establishments: general store, blacksmith, 2 saloons, a small church, and what appeared to be a newly constructed schoolhouse. That's when he saw her. Standing on the porch of the mercantile, arranging flowers in tin buckets, was a young woman unlike any he'd encountered in his years of wandering. Her chestnut brown hair cascaded in waves down her back, catching the last golden rays of sunlight. She wore a modest blue calico dress that somehow made her stand out more than any fancy parlor outfit ever could. When she looked up and met his gaze, Mason felt something he'd sworn never to feel again, a jolt, like lightning striking a lone tree on the prairie. Faith Fletcher was 22, and as far as the citizens of Cottonwood Springs knew, she was simply the quiet, kind-hearted young woman who had arrived 6 months ago to assist her uncle with the mercantile. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Faith Fletcher wasn't her real name, and the kindly old shopkeeper wasn't her uncle at all. "Evening, miss," Mason said, tipping his hat as he dismounted in front of the store. "Good evening," she replied, her voice soft but clear as a mountain stream. "You're new to town." It wasn't a question, but Mason nodded anyway. "Just passing through, need supplies before heading north." "Well, you're in luck. Uncle Harold has the finest supplies in 3 counties. She smiled, and for a moment, Mason forgot his own rule about keeping interactions brief and impersonal. "I could use some coffee and jerky for the trail," he said, finding himself suddenly reluctant to rush the transaction. "And maybe some advice on the best route to Helena." Faith's blue eyes, deep and mysterious as twilight, held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm sure we can help with all of that, Mr. Stark Mason Stark." Something flickered across her face, concern, perhaps even fear, but it vanished so quickly that Mason convinced himself he'd imagined it. "Faith Fletcher," she replied, extending a delicate hand that belied surprising strength when he shook it. "Come inside, Mr. Stark. The light's fading, and you look like a man who could use a hot cup of coffee before discussing your travels." Mason knew he should decline, get his supplies and find the local boarding house, keep his distance as he always did. But instead he found himself following Faith inside the store, drawn by something he couldn't, or wouldn't, name. He didn't see the way her hands trembled slightly as she turned away, or notice how she glanced toward the small drawer beneath the counter where she kept the wanted poster, the one with his face on it. Not his face exactly, but close enough to raise questions that Faith Fletcher wasn't prepared to answer. Not yet. 2 days stretched into a week. Mason told himself it was the work. Sheriff Collins had recognized his star and practically begged him to help with security for the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. The town had been having trouble with a gang of rustlers, and an extra gun would be welcome. But Mason knew it was Faith who kept him in Cottonwood Springs. Each morning, he found some excuse to visit the mercantile. Each evening he lingered at closing time, often walking her home to the small cabin behind the store she shared with old Harold. "You're not really his niece, are you?" Mason asked on one such walk, 6 days after his arrival. Faith's step faltered. "What makes you say that?" "The way you interact, it's respectful, kind even, but not familiar, not family." She studied him in the fading light. "You notice a lot for a man just passing through." "Noticing things keeps you alive out here," he replied. Faith sighed. "Harold was my father's friend. When Pa died 2 years ago, Harold offered me a place. He's been kind enough to call me family, though we share no blood." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. Mason nodded, understanding loss better than most. "My parents died in a fever outbreak when I was 16. Joined the Union Army at 18, been drifting since the war ended." "Always alone?" she asked, her voice softening. "It's safer that way." He hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the words slipped out anyway. Faith stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Is it safer or just lonelier?" The question hit him like a physical blow. No one had challenged his chosen isolation so directly before. "In my experience, people you care about end up dead or leaving. Either way, you're left with nothing but memories and regret." "That's a hard way to live," Mason Stark. "It's not living," he admitted. "It's surviving." "There's a difference." Faith reached out hesitantly, her fingers just barely touching his arm. "Maybe there doesn't have to be." The contact sent warmth spreading through him, melting something frozen inside his chest. Warning bells clanged in his mind, but for once, Mason ignored them. "Maybe," he conceded, and it felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever said. What Mason couldn't know was that Faith had her own reasons to keep people at a distance. Her own secrets that made any connection, especially with a lawman, a risk she couldn't afford to take. Yet here she was, touching his arm, looking into eyes that made her forget all the reasons why she should run in the opposite direction. The next morning everything changed. Sheriff Collins burst into the boarding house before dawn, his face grave. "Mason, get up, son. There's been a robbery at the Miners' Exchange. 2 men shot, 1 dead." Mason was on his feet instantly, pulling on his boots. Descriptions. 3 men, faces covered. But one thing's certain, they knew exactly when the gold shipment arrived and exactly how to get to it. This was an inside job, or they had help from someone in town. A cold feeling settled in Mason's stomach. "Any leads?" "Not yet, but I've sent for the territorial marshal. Should be here within the week. Until then, I need your help questioning folks." As Mason buckled on his gun belt, his mind turned to Faith. Would she hear about the robbery and worry? He'd planned to take her on a picnic that afternoon, a decision he'd made only the night before when he'd finally admitted to himself that Cottonwood Springs was becoming more than just another temporary stop. "I'll start at the mercantile," Mason said. "Harold sees everyone who comes through town, might have noticed something." The sheriff nodded, good thinking. But when Mason reached the store, he found only Harold, his weathered face drawn with concern. "Where's Faith?" Mason asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Been wondering the same myself," Harold replied. "Her bed wasn't slept in last night, thought maybe." The old man's eyes studied Mason with sudden suspicion. "I walked her home at 9 and left her at your door," Mason said quickly. "She's gone." The knot in his stomach tightened. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Let me look in her room," Mason said, already moving toward the back of the store. Harold followed, his limp more pronounced in his haste. "She's a good girl, deputy, whatever you're thinking." Mason pushed open the door to Faith's small room and froze. The bed was neatly made, but the room had been cleared of personal belongings. The small trunk she kept at the foot of her bed was gone. On the pillow lay a sealed envelope with Harold's name on it. The old man pushed past Mason and snatched up the letter with trembling hands. As he read, his face crumpled. "She's gone," Harold whispered. "Says she's sorry, but it was time to move on, that she never meant to." he trailed off, folding the letter before Mason could see more. Never meant to what? Mason demanded, his voice sharper than intended. Harold shook his head. Just says she's sorry for leaving without a proper goodbye, that's all. But Mason didn't believe him, not completely. The timing was too convenient, a gold robbery and Faith's disappearance on the same night. It could be coincidence, but Mason's years as a lawman had taught him to be suspicious of coincidences. Did she take a horse? He asked. No. She didn't have one of her own. The stage doesn't run until Thursday. She might have caught a ride with someone passing through, Harold suggested, but his eyes wouldn't meet Mason's. Mason turned to leave, his mind racing. If you hear from her, I'll let you know, Harold promised, but something in his tone told Mason that the old man wouldn't be forthcoming even if Faith did send word. Outside, Mason paused on the porch where he had first seen her. Had it all been a lie, the connection he'd felt, the way she'd seemed to understand his loneliness because she carried her own? He'd begun to think that maybe, just maybe, he'd found a reason to stop running. Now it seemed Faith had been running too, just in a different direction. I told you, he muttered to himself, this is why you don't get attached. But even as he said it, Mason knew he would go after her. Not just because her disappearance coincided with the robbery, but because for the first time in years, he cared about someone enough to chase them across the territory if necessary. Sheriff Collins wouldn't like it, but Mason had already decided. He'd follow Faith Fletcher and discover what she was hiding, even if it broke what remained of his guarded heart. 3 days of hard riding led Mason to a small mining town called Redemption, 40 miles east of Cottonwood Springs. Faith's trail hadn't been difficult to follow once he'd discovered she'd paid a local rancher's son to drive her to the nearest railway station in the middle of the night. The station master there remembered a pretty young woman with chestnut hair boarding the eastbound train, ticket paid in gold coin. Redemption was little more than a collection of rough buildings clustered around a promising silver strike. The main street was mud and disappointment, lined with saloons that never closed and men whose dreams had curdled into bitterness. Mason's instincts screamed that Faith didn't belong in such a place, which made her choice of destination all the more puzzling. He left Copper at the livery and made his way to the largest saloon, the Silver Baron. If anyone knew about newcomers to town, it would be the barkeep or the girls who worked the floor. The saloon was busy despite the early hour, miners from the night shift drowning the memory of darkness before heading to their beds. Mason approached the bar, ordering whiskey he didn't intend to drink. New in town, the barkeeper asked, a mountain of a man with a braided beard. Looking for someone, Mason replied, sliding a coin across the bar. Young woman, early 20s, chestnut hair, beautiful, would have arrived by yesterday's train. The man's eyes narrowed. She in trouble? Not with me, Mason said carefully. Just need to talk to her. You law, the barkeeper nodded toward Mason's vest, where the deputy's star had been until he'd removed it before leaving Cottonwood Springs. Not here, I'm not. The barkeeper seemed to consider this, then nodded toward the stairs. Room 4, been holed up there since yesterday, paid a week in advance, said she was waiting for someone. Mason's heart quickened. Waiting for someone, one of her accomplices from the robbery, a lover, both possibilities twisted in his gut. Thanks, he said, leaving the untouched whiskey on the bar. The second floor was quieter, the corridor dimly lit by oil lamps. Mason paused outside room 4, listening. No sound came from within. He considered his approach. He could wait, watch to see who she might meet. That would be the smart play, the lawman's approach. Instead, he knocked. A long silence followed. He was about to knock again when he heard movement inside. The door opened a crack secured by a chain and a blue eye peered out. It widened in shock. Mason, Faith's voice was a hoarse whisper. How did you? You're not as difficult to track as you might think, he said, his voice cooler than he intended. We need to talk. You shouldn't be here, fear laced her words. Please just go back to Cottonwood Springs. Forget you ever met me. There was a robbery the night you left, gold shipment from the mine, 1 man dead. The color drained from her face, and you think I had something to do with it. It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. The timing is suspicious. I didn't rob anyone, she said firmly. Now please go away before. A sound from further down the hallway made her flinch. Mason turned to see a man ascending the stairs, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. Something about his posture, the deliberate way he moved, set off warning bells in Mason's head. Faith saw him too. Inside, quickly, she hissed, closing the door just enough to release the chain, then pulling Mason into the room. The space was small, a bed, a dresser, a washstand. Faith's trunk sat unopened in the corner. She immediately went to the window, peering out as if calculating an escape route. "Who is that man?" Mason demanded. "One of your partners." Faith turned to him, anger flashing in her eyes. "You don't understand anything." "Then explain it to me," he said, stepping closer. "Because I thought," he stopped, unwilling to admit what he'd begun to hope for during their brief time together. Faith's anger melted into something sadder, more vulnerable. "You thought what? That I was just a simple shop girl, that we might have a future together?" She shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mason, I never meant to. I shouldn't have let you get close." "Who are you really?" She took a deep breath. "My name is Faith Fletcher, that part is true. But I'm not here by accident, and I didn't leave Cottonwood Springs because of any robbery." "Then why?" "Because of you," she said softly, "because of who you look like." Mason frowned. "What does that mean?" Before she could answer, heavy footsteps stopped outside the door, followed by 3 sharp knocks. "Fletcher, I know you're in there, open up." The voice was cold, authoritative. Faith's eyes widened in panic. "It's Pinkerton," she whispered. "He can't find you here." "Pinkerton, as in the detective agency?" Mason's mind raced. "Faith, what have you done?" "Nothing," she insisted. "Please hide in the wardrobe." "I'll get rid of him." The knocking came again, more insistent. "Miss Fletcher, I saw you let someone in. Open this door or I'll have the manager open it for me." With no time to argue, Mason slipped into the narrow wardrobe, pulling the door nearly closed. Through the crack he watched as Faith smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The man who entered was tall and lean, with cold eyes that missed nothing. He wore a suit despite the frontier setting, and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Detective Morgan," Faith said coolly, "I told you I'd contact you when I had information." "And yet you fled Cottonwood Springs without a word," Morgan replied. "Then I hear about a robbery coinciding with your departure. Makes a man wonder." "I left because Deputy Stark was becoming too attentive. He resembles the target too closely. I feared he might compromise the operation." Mason's breath caught in his throat. Operation, target. "Speaking of the deputy," Morgan said, glancing around the room, "who did you just let in here?" "A porter," Faith answered smoothly. "I needed fresh water." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "You're lying, Miss Fletcher. Your skills may have impressed the agency, but remember who trained you." "I haven't forgotten," she replied, her voice hardening. "Just as I haven't forgotten your promise. Find Michael Stark and my brother goes free." Mason felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Michael Stark, his brother, the brother he'd believed dead for 5 years. "Your brother attempted to rob a bank," Morgan said dismissively. "Actions have consequences." "He was coerced," Faith snapped, "by the very man you sent me to find. The man who killed your agents and stole that gold shipment you're so concerned about." "Michael Stark is a murderer and a thief," Morgan insisted, "and you promised to help us catch him." "And I will," Faith said. "But not at the expense of innocent people. Mason Stark is not his brother. He deserves to be left out of this." Mason's mind reeled. His brother alive, a wanted criminal, and Faith, was she some kind of Pinkerton operative? Had everything between them been a lie, a means to get to his brother? "No one is innocent in this business, Miss Fletcher," Morgan was saying. "Now I'll ask once more, who did you let into this room?" Faith stood her ground. "There's no one here but me." Morgan studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Very well, I'll give you 3 more days to make contact with Michael Stark." After that, our arrangement is void and your brother faces the noose. He moved toward the door. Oh, and Miss Fletcher, if I discover you've been harboring the fugitive or misleading the agency, you'll join your brother on those gallows. When the door closed behind the detective, Faith sagged against it, her composure crumbling. After a moment she crossed to the wardrobe. You can come out now. Mason pushed the door open, his mind still processing everything he'd heard. My brother is alive. Faith nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Yes. And you've been hunting him for the Pinkertons. It's not that simple, she said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. Please let me explain. Mason remained standing, his body tense. I'm listening. Faith took a deep breath. My brother, Freddie, worked for the Territorial Bank in Helena. 8 months ago, a man came in with a gang and forced him to open the vault by threatening to kill a teller. They took everything, including bonds intended for the territorial government. And this man was my brother, Michael. That's what the Pinkertons believe, Faith said. Witnesses identified him. But Freddie insisted the leader only called himself Stark, said it was a man with a scar across his right cheek. Mason frowned. Michael doesn't have a scar. I know, Faith said quietly. When I saw you in Cottonwood Springs, I realized immediately you weren't the man from the wanted posters. You look similar, but, she finally met his gaze, you're not him. So you were using me to get to my brother, Mason said, the betrayal bitter on his tongue. No, Faith stood, moving toward him. At first I thought you might lead me to him. Detective Morgan arranged for me to be placed in Cottonwood Springs because there were rumors Michael had been seen in the area. But the more time I spent with you, the more I realized you couldn't be connected to the robberies. And yet you ran when the gold was stolen. Faith's eyes filled with tears. I ran because I received a telegram from Freddie. He said the man with the scar had visited him in prison, threatening to kill me if Freddie revealed his true identity. I had to leave to protect you, to protect everyone in Cottonwood Springs. Mason wanted to believe her. God help him, he wanted it more than he'd wanted anything in years. But the lawman in him, the part hardened by war and loss, remained skeptical. If what you're saying is true, why come here to redemption? Because this is where the man claiming to be Michael Stark is supposed to be meeting his gang in 3 days, Faith explained. I came to see his face for myself, to prove to the Pinkertons that they're after the wrong man. And then what? Mason asked. What happens when you find this imposter? Faith's expression hardened. I'm going to clear my brother's name and make sure the real criminal pays for his crimes. Alone, against a gang of armed robbers. I didn't have a choice, she said defensively. I couldn't involve you, not when I learned you were Michael's brother. Mason ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts chaotic. This is madness, Faith. If what you're saying is true, these men are killers. They'll cut you down without a second thought. I know the risks, she said quietly, but Freddie is all the family I have left. I'd do anything to save him. Wouldn't you do the same for your brother? The question hit Mason like a physical blow. Would he, the brother he'd thought dead for 5 years, who had apparently never tried to contact him? Yet even as doubt clouded his thoughts, Mason knew the answer. Yes, he would risk everything for family, even family he believed he'd lost forever. Where is Michael now? He asked. Do you know? Faith shook her head. I don't. The Pinkertons have been searching for months with no success. That's why they were so interested when a man using his name started robbing banks and gold shipments. Mason paced the small room, considering their options. We need proof. Proof that this scarred man is impersonating my brother. That's why I'm here, Faith said. The gang is meeting at an abandoned mining camp 5 miles north of town. If I can get close enough to see his face, maybe even get a daguerreotype. No, Mason said firmly. It's too dangerous, I'll go. You can't if Morgan discovers you're involved. I don't give a damn about Morgan or the Pinkertons, Mason interrupted. This is my brother we're talking about. And if someone is using his name to commit murders and robberies, I need to know why. Faith studied him, her expression softening. You believe me then. Mason sighed. I don't know what to believe anymore. But I know that running from connections, from people who might matter to me, hasn't brought me any peace. Maybe it's time I stopped running and faced whatever comes. Faith moved closer, her hand coming to rest on his arm. I never meant to hurt you, Mason. Everything between us, it wasn't all a lie, not the parts that mattered. He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. Despite everything, he still saw the woman who had challenged his isolation, who had made him consider putting down roots for the first time since the war. We'll figure this out, he said finally. Together, but Faith, no more secrets, not between us. She nodded, relief washing over her features. No more secrets. As Mason pulled her into his arms, he wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life, or finally finding his way home. Either way, there was no turning back now. The abandoned mining camp loomed against the twilight sky, a collection of weathered structures that nature was slowly reclaiming. Mason and Faith crouched behind a ridge overlooking the desolate scene, watching for any sign of movement. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Mason whispered. They'd been waiting for hours with no sign of the gang. Faith nodded. "According to my source, they always meet here before a job. The silver ran out 2 years ago, but the buildings provide cover, and there's only one road in." Mason shifted, his hand resting on his revolver. They'd spent the past 2 days planning, arguing, and finally compromising on a strategy. Faith would remain hidden with a spyglass, documenting who arrived. Mason, less recognizable to the gang than a Pinkerton agent might be, would pose as a drifter seeking work if confronted. What they hadn't planned on was the rain that had begun falling an hour earlier, a steady drizzle that had soaked through their clothes and made the night air bite with unexpected chill. "Someone's coming," Faith whispered suddenly, pointing toward the road. Through the gathering darkness, Mason could make out 3 riders approaching at a steady pace. They dismounted at the largest structure, likely once the foreman's office, and disappeared inside. Soon, a dim light glowed from within. "More," Faith murmured as 2 additional riders emerged from the trees to the east, followed by a wagon driven by a solitary figure. Within half an hour, the camp had come alive with activity. Mason counted at least 8 men, moving between buildings, unloading supplies from the wagon. "We need to get closer," Faith said, adjusting the spyglass. "I can't make out faces from here." Mason frowned. "It's too risky. If they catch you—" "If we can't identify the leader, this is all for nothing," she interrupted. "There's a path down the back of this ridge that leads to those storage sheds. I can circle around and get a better view without being seen." Before Mason could object, Faith was already moving, keeping low to the ground. Cursing under his breath, he followed, unwilling to let her face the danger alone. The path was treacherous in the rain, mud sucking at their boots as they descended carefully toward the cluster of storage buildings that had once housed mining equipment. As they neared the bottom, Faith slipped suddenly, a small cry escaping her lips as she slid several feet before Mason caught her arm. They froze, listening for any indication they'd been heard over the drumming of rain on the wooden roofs. When no alarm was raised, they continued their cautious approach until they reached the shadow of the closest shed. "The main building is just across that clearing," Faith whispered. "If the leader is here, he'll be inside." Mason peered around the edge of the shed. Approximately 50 yards of open ground separated them from their target. A man stood guard at the door, occasionally stamping his feet against the cold. "Wait here," Mason said, his decision made. "I'm going to circle around to the back. There might be a window or another entrance." Faith caught his arm. "Be careful," she said, her eyes reflecting the distant lamplight. "If it is your brother in there." "I'll handle it," he assured her, though how, he wasn't entirely sure. Moving from shadow to shadow, Mason made his way around the perimeter of the clearing. The rain provided cover, muffling his footsteps and reducing visibility for the guards. When he reached the back of the main building, he found what he was hoping for, a small window, dimly illuminated from within. Crouching beneath it, Mason slowly raised himself until he could peer inside. The room was crowded with men, some he recognized from wanted posters that had crossed his desk during his time as deputy. They were gathered around a table where maps were spread out, weighted down by bottles of whiskey and revolvers. At the head of the table stood a man whose presence commanded attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and a beard that didn't quite hide the jagged scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw. As he turned to address someone, Mason got a clear view of his face. It wasn't Michael. There was a resemblance, enough that someone who didn't know Michael well might be fooled, but this wasn't Mason's brother. Relief and confusion battled within him as he strained to hear what was being said. "Shipment leaves tomorrow at noon," the scarred man was saying. "Fuller, you and Jenks take positions here and here." He pointed to locations on the map. "Martinez, you're driving the wagon. Remember, we're not looking for a fight, but if those guards resist, show no mercy." "What about the Pinkertons?" one of the men asked. "Word is they're closing in." The leader laughed, a cold sound that raised the hair on Mason's neck. "Let them come. By the time they figure out which Stark they're chasing, we'll be long gone with enough gold to disappear forever." So it was deliberate. This man was intentionally using the Stark name. But why? Mason had heard enough. He needed to get back to Faith with this information, then find a way to alert the authorities without revealing their presence. Carefully, he began to back away from the window. A twig snapped beneath his boot. Inside, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Check outside," the leader ordered. "All directions." Mason turned to run just as the back door burst open, spilling lamplight across the muddy ground. A shout went up, followed by the unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked. "Don't move," a gruff voice commanded. Mason froze, calculating his chances. He could draw his own weapon, might even get a shot off, but against multiple armed men. The odds weren't good. "Turn around slow." Mason complied, raising his hands to show they were empty. Two men stood in the doorway, both with guns trained on his chest. "Well, look what we found," one said, grinning through a matted beard. "Bring him inside, Duffy. Boss will want to see this." Rough hands shoved Mason through the door and into the room he'd been observing. The men around the table looked up in surprise, conversations dying as the scarred leader turned to assess the intruder. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the leader's face split into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice carrying a hint of the South. "If it isn't the younger Stark brother himself. Mason, isn't it?" My, this is an unexpected pleasure." Mason kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. This man knew him, knew his name, recognized his face. "Who are you?" Mason asked, keeping his voice steady. The scarred man laughed. "Don't recognize me. I suppose I have changed a bit since Petersburg." He gestured to his face. "War leaves its marks, doesn't it?" "Petersburg, the siege during the war." Mason searched his memory, trying to place this man among the faces of soldiers he'd fought alongside. "Colton Fuller," the man said, apparently tired of waiting. "We served in the same company for 6 months before that Confederate shell rearranged my features." His expression hardened. "Your brother was there too, of course. Lieutenant Michael Stark, the decorated hero who left his men to die when the line broke." The accusation hit Mason like a physical blow. "That's a lie. Michael was reported killed when the Confederates broke through." "Is that what they told you?" Fuller shook his head, mock sympathy in his eyes. "Your brother ran, Mason, left me and 20 other men to face the Confederate charge while he saved his own skin. I survived barely, but most didn't. If what you're saying is true, why impersonate him? Why not just kill him?" "Death is too quick," Fuller spat. "I want him to suffer like I suffered, like the families of those dead men suffered. I want the Stark name dragged through the mud until it stands for nothing but cowardice and treachery." His eyes gleamed with a fanatic light. "And when I'm done, when everyone believes Michael Stark is a murderer and a thief, then I'll find him and kill him, slowly." The hatred in the man's voice was palpable. Whether his accusation against Michael was true or not, Fuller clearly believed it with every fiber of his being. "And what about me?" Mason asked, buying time, hoping Faith had the sense to stay hidden. "I never did anything to you." Fuller seemed to consider this. "No, you didn't, In fact, if memory serves, you were one of the few decent officers in that godforsaken army. He leaned forward. So I'll give you a choice, Mason. Join us for tomorrow's job, prove you're not cut from the same cloth as your coward brother, and you walk away rich. Refuse and you die right here. Mason knew it was a lie. Fuller had no intention of letting him walk away, not when he could serve as bait for Michael. "Where is my brother now?" Mason asked. "That's the fascinating part," Fuller said, pouring himself a drink. "I don't know. Your brother disappeared after Petersburg, didn't go home, didn't rejoin the army. It's like he vanished." He took a swig of whiskey. "But he's alive. I've tracked rumors from Missouri to California. He's out there, and eventually he'll hear about the notorious Michael Stark terrorizing the territories. When that happens, he'll either come out of hiding to clear his name, or he'll run even deeper." Fuller smiled coldly. "Either way, his life is ruined." Mason's mind raced. If Michael was alive, why hadn't he tried to contact his only living family? Had shame kept him away, or was Fuller's story of cowardice just another lie? "Time's running out, Mason," Fuller said, setting down his glass. "What's it going to be? Are you with us, or are you joining those guards in an unmarked grave tomorrow?" Before Mason could answer, shouts erupted from outside, followed by the crack of gunfire. The men in the room tensed, reaching for weapons. "What the hell?" Fuller growled, drawing his revolver. The door burst open and a gang member staggered in, clutching a bleeding arm. "Pinkertons," he gasped. "At least 6 of them coming up the road." Chaos erupted. Men grabbed maps and weapons, overturning the table in their haste. Fuller's eyes never left Mason's face, cold fury replacing his earlier amusement. "You led them here," he accused, raising his gun. "Was this your plan all along?" "I'm not working with the Pinkertons," Mason insisted, though his thoughts immediately went to Faith. Had she somehow signaled for help? Fuller's finger tightened on the trigger. "Goodbye, Mason. Give your brother my regards in hell." A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Fuller's gun. The window behind Mason shattered as Fuller staggered backward, blood blossoming on his shoulder. Outside, the gunfire intensified. Taking advantage of the confusion, Mason lunged forward, tackling Fuller to the ground. The revolver discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as they grappled on the rough wooden floor. Fuller was strong, fueled by years of hatred, but Mason fought with the desperation of a man with something to live for, someone to return to. With a savage blow to the jaw, Mason finally subdued Fuller, the scarred man slumping unconscious beneath him. Grabbing Fuller's discarded revolver, Mason turned to find himself facing the barrel of another gun. "Don't move, Stark." Detective Morgan stood in the doorway, his expression grim. "I'm not your enemy," Mason said, carefully placing Fuller's gun on the floor. "This man has been impersonating my brother. He's the one responsible for the robberies and murders." Morgan's eyes flicked to the unconscious Fuller, then back to Mason. "Where's Faith Fletcher?" As if summoned by her name, Faith appeared behind Morgan, her face streaked with mud and rain. "I'm here," she said, "and he's telling the truth, Detective. This is Colton Fuller. He served with Michael Stark during the war and has been using his name for the robberies." Morgan kept his gun trained on Mason. "And how do I know this isn't some elaborate ruse? 2 Stark brothers working together." "Because I've been a lawman for the past 3 years," Mason said evenly. "Check with the sheriff in Silver Creek or Sheriff Collins in Cottonwood Springs. I was deputy in both towns." "It's true," Faith insisted. "Mason had nothing to do with the robberies. He's been helping me expose Fuller." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Morgan lowered his gun. "We'll sort this out back in town. The rest of my men are rounding up Fuller's gang." He nodded toward the unconscious man. "Get him up. He's got a lot to answer for." As Morgan turned to issue orders to his agents, Faith rushed to Mason's side, her hands checking him for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "When I heard the shooting." "I'm fine," he assured her, clasping her hands in his. "What happened? Did you signal Morgan somehow?" She shook her head. "They must have been following us, or maybe they were already watching Fuller." Her eyes searched his. "Did you learn anything about your brother?" Mason nodded grimly. Fuller claims Michael ran during a battle, left his men to die. Says he's been hunting him ever since, trying to destroy his reputation before killing him. Do you believe him? I don't know, Mason admitted. The brother I knew would never abandon his men, but war changes people. He looked at Faith intently. What matters now is clearing his name of these robberies and finding him, if he's still alive. Faith squeezed his hands. We'll find him, Mason, together. As Pinkerton agents led a now conscious and cursing Fuller from the building, Mason realized something had shifted within him. For years, he'd avoided connections, convinced that caring only led to pain. Yet here he was, fighting not just for his own survival but for his brother's reputation and for a future with Faith. Perhaps the frontier wasn't only a place of loss and hardship. Perhaps, with the right person by your side, it could also be a place of redemption and new beginnings. 2 months later, Mason stood on the porch of a newly constructed cabin, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Behind him, Faith moved about the small but comfortable home they now shared, preparing their evening meal. Fuller's capture had created quite a stir throughout the territory. With the real culprit in custody and the Pinkerton agency acknowledging their mistake, Faith's brother Freddie had been released from prison with a formal apology and compensation for his ordeal. Mason had resigned his deputy position in Cottonwood Springs, but not before helping Sheriff Collins hire a suitable replacement. He and Faith had returned to the small town briefly to collect her belongings and explain the truth to Harold, who had been more relieved than angry about Faith's deception. "Penny for your thoughts?" Faith asked, joining him on the porch, her warmth a welcome contrast to the autumn chill. Mason smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, just thinking about how much has changed. 2 months ago, I was convinced I'd spend my life drifting from town to town, never putting down roots. Faith leaned into his embrace, and now I have a home, he said simply. A real home, not just a place to sleep. The homestead they'd claimed was modest but promising, 20 acres of good land with access to water, halfway between Cottonwood Springs and the territorial capital. Close enough to civilization for comfort, far enough for peace. Any word from the Pinkertons? Faith asked, the question she posed every few days. Mason shook his head. Not yet. But Morgan promised to let us know if they find any trace of Michael. Following Fuller's arrest, the Pinkerton agency had agreed to search for the real Michael Stark, partly out of a sense of obligation, and partly because Fuller's testimony about the Petersburg incident had raised questions about wartime desertion that the Army wanted answered. He'll turn up, Faith said with a confidence Mason wished he shared, especially now that it's safe for him to come home. Mason wasn't so sure. If Fuller's accusations contained even a grain of truth, shame might keep Michael hidden forever. But he'd come to accept that some questions might never be answered, some wounds never fully healed. The important thing was that he'd stopped running from connections, stopped believing that loving someone was a weakness rather than a strength. I have something for you, Mason said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden box, hand-carved with a simple flower pattern. I've been waiting for the right moment. Faith's eyes widened as she took the box, opening it carefully to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in its center. It was my mother's, Mason explained. The only thing of hers I managed to keep through the war and everything after. Faith looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. Mason. I know it hasn't been long, he continued, suddenly nervous. And our beginning wasn't exactly conventional, but I love you, Faith Fletcher. I love your courage and your loyalty and the way you challenged me to stop running from life. He took a deep breath. Will you marry me? Faith's answer came not in words but in action as she threw her arms around his neck, the ring box clutched tightly in one hand. When she finally pulled back, her smile was radiant despite the tears on her cheeks. Yes, she whispered, 1,000 times yes. As Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, a rider appeared on the road leading to their homestead. Both turned to watch as the figure approached, too distant yet to identify. "Are we expecting anyone?" Faith asked, her hand finding Mason's. Mason shook his head, instinctively reaching for the revolver he no longer wore constantly. "Stay here," he said, moving down the porch steps. The rider slowed as he neared the cabin, finally stopping several yards away. He was a tall man, lean and weathered by years on the trail. His beard was shot through with gray, and his clothes were dusty from long travel. Something about the way he sat his horse, the set of his shoulders, struck Mason as hauntingly familiar. "Can I help you?" Mason called, one hand resting on the porch railing, ready to move if necessary. The rider dismounted slowly, almost cautiously, leading his horse forward. As he came into the fading light, Mason could see his face clearly for the first time. The years had changed him, hardened him, lined his face with experiences Mason could only guess at. But the eyes were the same. The same eyes Mason saw in his own reflection. "Michael," he whispered, hardly daring to believe. The man stopped, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face: hope, fear, shame, and finally, resolution. "Hello, little brother," Michael Stark said, his voice rough from disuse or emotion. "It's been a long time." Faith descended the porch steps to stand beside Mason, her hand slipping into his for support. Mason stood frozen, a thousand questions fighting for precedence in his mind. "How did you find us?" he finally managed. Michael smiled faintly. "Pinkerton agent named Morgan tracked me down in Oregon. Told me quite a story about a man using my name to rob banks and a brother who never stopped believing in me." He looked at Faith, then back to Mason. "Said I might find you here, starting a new life." "Is it true?" Mason asked, the question that had haunted him for weeks finally finding voice. "What Fuller said about Petersburg?" Michael's face grew solemn. "Yes and no, the line broke, men died, I survived when others didn't." He met Mason's gaze steadily. "But I didn't run to save myself. I was captured, spent 8 months in a Confederate prison camp before escaping." His voice dropped. "By then, the war was nearly over, and I wasn't the same man who went in. Couldn't face going home, facing you with what I'd become." "So you just disappeared," Mason said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Let everyone believe you were dead." Michael nodded, his shame evident. "It seemed easier than explaining. Than admitting I'd failed to protect my men." He swallowed hard. "I've spent 5 years trying to outrun that day, working ranch jobs, staying nowhere long enough to form attachments." Sound familiar? It did, all too familiar. "Why come back now?" Mason asked. "Because Morgan made me realize something," Michael said. "Running doesn't erase the past, it just stops you from building a future." He gestured to Faith, to the cabin behind them. "You figured that out before I did, little brother." Faith squeezed Mason's hand, a silent reminder of his own journey from isolation to connection. "We've both done enough running," Mason said finally. He released Faith's hand and stepped forward, pulling his brother into an embrace that bridged 5 years of absence and a lifetime of unspoken words. When they separated, both men's eyes were suspiciously bright. Michael cleared his throat. "I should be on my way. Just wanted to see you, make sure you were all right." "Don't be ridiculous," Faith said, stepping forward. "You're staying for dinner at the very least. I'm Faith, by the way. Faith Fletcher, soon to be Faith Stark." Michael looked between them, a genuine smile softening his weathered features. "Engaged? Well, now that's something worth celebrating." As they led Michael toward the cabin, the horses seen to and the evening meal waiting, Mason felt a sense of completion he hadn't known was missing. The frontier had taken much from him over the years: parents, comrades, the innocence of youth. But it had given something back as well: a home, a future with Faith, and now, against all odds, a brother returned from the shadows of the past. "Stay," Mason said as they reached the porch. "Not just for dinner. There's land enough here for another cabin, work enough for 2 men." Michael hesitated. "I'm not sure I'd make good company. There are things. Memories that don't fade easily." "All the more reason not to face them alone," Faith said gently. "Family doesn't heal all wounds, but it makes them easier to bear." As they entered the warmth of the cabin, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky outside, Mason knew that Faith was right. The frontier would always be a place of hardship and challenge, but it was also a place where second chances were possible, where new beginnings could rise from the ashes of the past. He had spent years believing that connections were dangerous, that caring for others only led to pain. Now, with Faith by his side and his brother returned from the dead, Mason understood the truth that had eluded him for so long. The heart's greatest strength isn't in the walls it builds, but in the bridges it dares to construct, even in the wildest of territories.